Olá, boa noite. Sejam muito bem-vindos ao Roda Viva. Nós estamos no ar para todo o Brasil, pela TV Cultura e emissoras afiliadas, conectados ao mundo todo por meio das principais plataformas digitais e do app Cultura Play. Muita coisa aconteceu desde que o nosso entrevistado esteve no Roda Viva pela primeira vez, há pouco menos de 3 anos. O Brasil estava em plena campanha eleitoral de 2022, uma disputa acirrada entre Lula e Jair Bolsonaro. Nos Estados Unidos, Donald Trump havia sido derrotado e sua volta ao poder parecia difícil depois das cenas da invasão ao Capitólio e as múltiplas ações judiciais que ele enfrentava. No ano seguinte, foi lançada a continuação do seu aclamado sucesso Como as Democracias Morrem, escrito também em coautoria com Daniel Ziblatt e lançado no Brasil pela Zahar com o título de Como Salvar a Democracia. A obra propunha uma profunda reformulação das instituições americanas para evitar um novo período de ameaça à democracia. Não só isso não aconteceu, como o próprio Trump foi eleito para um novo mandato e em poucos meses já implementou políticas de viés autoritário em praticamente todas as áreas, da imigração ao comércio exterior. O Brasil se vê no centro das ações de Trump. Numa só tacada, o republicano aplicou um tarifaço aos produtos brasileiros e determinou sanções contra o ministro Alexandre de Moraes do Supremo Tribunal Federal. A justificativa para ambas as medidas é o apoio de Trump a Bolsonaro. Para falar de todas essas questões, analisar a rápida erosão da democracia americana e os seus efeitos para o mundo e para o Brasil, recebemos pela segunda vez no Roda Viva o cientista político e professor de Harvard, Steven Levitsky.
Steven Robert Levitsky nasceu em 17 de janeiro de 1968 em Ítaca, no estado de Nova York. É bacharel em Ciências Políticas pela Universidade de Stanford e doutor pela Universidade da Califórnia, Berkeley. Foi pesquisador visitante no Instituto Kellogg de Estudos Internacionais da Universidade de Notre Dame e ingressou na Universidade de Harvard em 2000, onde é professor e diretor do Centro David Rockefeller para Estudos Latino-Americanos. Também é autor e coautor de diversos livros, incluindo o best-seller Como as Democracias Morrem, publicado em 30 idiomas.
Para entrevistar o professor Steven Levitsky, nós convidamos Eduardo Graça, repórter especial do jornal O Globo, Luciana Coelho, secretária assistente de redação e colunista da Folha de São Paulo, Robinson Borges, editor executivo do jornal Valor Econômico, Silvia Colombo, jornalista, historiadora e colunista da Folha de São Paulo, e Itamar Montalvão, editorialista do jornal O Estado de São Paulo. A tradução simultânea será da Áurea Delbó e os desenhos em tempo real do Luciano Veronese. Professor, boa noite. Muito obrigada por estar aqui com a gente de novo. No livro Como Salvar a Democracia, vocês descrevem o risco de uma minoria branca e cristã ditar a política norte-americana. Bom, 2 anos depois do lançamento do livro, Donald Trump foi eleito e dessa vez contou com a vitória também no voto popular. Ele teve, inclusive, votos em comunidades de latinos e outras minorias que ele costuma atacar. O que explica essa nova vitória e como fazer com que ele seja contido de alguma maneira?
That's a tough question. First of all, thanks for having me here. You forgot to note in your introduction that in my 2022 appearance before the World Cup, I predicted that Argentina would win the World Cup. So
it's true.
I may not know anything about politics, but about soccer, I looks like I'm a genius.
Okay.
You ask a great question. The United States has a very solid two-party system. And in much of the democratic world in the last few years, especially since the pandemic, there has been a lot of discontent, a lot of anger in electorates all over the world. In fact, in more than 80% of the democratic elections in Europe, in Latin America, in North America, oppositions have won. Voters are angry with the status quo, and whether it's left, right, or center, they are voting out incumbents. And that is, in large part, what happened in the last election, 2024, in the United States. People were unhappy about inflation. They were unhappy about the economy. They were still in a very grumpy mood after the pandemic. And Joe Biden, the incumbent administration, just like incumbent administrations in the UK and in Canada at the time, and in France and in Germany, it was unpopular. And because we have a two-party system, a very, very entrenched two-party system, Donald Trump was the alternative. And it's true, a majority of Latinos still voted against Trump, but a much larger number of non-white, non-Christian voters voted for Trump. This was mostly just an opposition vote, a vote against the status quo by voters who were really grumpy.
Sim. Robson, por favor.
Professor, não chama um pouco a atenção o senhor dizer que há um desejo dos eleitores por uma alternância de poder e, ao mesmo tempo, a gente vê no mundo o crescimento de movimentos antidemocráticos, onde existe uma espécie de autoritarismo competitivo, como o senhor chama, de haver eleições, embora as instituições entrem em colapso e os partidos que estão no poder fazem de tudo para comprometer o judiciário, o Congresso, enfim. Não é um tanto quanto paradoxal esses dois movimentos ocorrerem simultaneamente? Como o senhor vê essa questão?
This is the great danger today. Voters are across the democratic world, across Latin America and elsewhere, still want to vote. They still want they want elections, but they're very, very unhappy with the status quo. And so not only are voters turning against incumbent governments, incumbents are losing everywhere, but established opposition parties like the Tucanos in Brazil, are not winning. It's outsiders, it's political outsiders, often newcomers who are not politicians, who are not from established parties, who rail against the entire political elite. Those are the ones who are winning. Bukele, Bolsonaro, Milei, Chavez in Costa Rica, Castillo in Peru. And not all of these outsiders are authoritarian, but many of them are. Many of them are not trained in politics. They're not socialized into democratic norms. And often they win election by attacking, telling voters, promising voters that they will bring down the entire hated political elite. And very often they come to power, and that gets them into conflict with Congress, because Congress is full of the old political elite, and it gets them in conflict with the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court was appointed by the old political elite. And very, very often, whether it's Hugo Chavez or Fujimori or Correa or more recently Milei, Bukele, these guys end up in constitutional crises. They end up fighting with other institutions of democracy. It doesn't always kill democracy, but it dramatically increases the likelihood of some kind of a democratic crisis. And we saw that in the United States after the 2020 election, and we saw it here in Brazil.
Por favor, Edu.
Professor, prazer revê-lo. Como o senhor sabe, nós aqui na América Latina temos memórias dolorosas da interferência americana em nosso continente, especialmente durante a Guerra Fria. Quando Washington volta a se referir à região como o seu quintal, fala em retomar o Canal do Panamá, em ações militares para combater cartéis de drogas na região. Autoridades do primeiro escalão do governo americano criticam instituições, caso do Brasil. Obviamente, esse fantasma, de uma certa forma, retorna para nós aqui. Qual seria a melhor maneira de países, incluindo o Brasil, de lidar com essa que parece ser uma nova era de interferência dos Estados Unidos na região?
That is a great question. In fact, if I knew the answer to that question, I think I would have a much better paying job. The Trump administration, first of all, is a very personalist government. It's a government where decisions are being made sometimes at the whim of a president who does not know history, who doesn't read, who understands very little about the post-World War II international order, and which is it's frightening that the guy in charge of the most powerful government in the world doesn't fully understand the post-World War II international era, but that's where we are. And so Trump's instincts, in some cases, are pulling us back to behavior that the United States has not regularly engaged in a very, very long time. Open, naked bullying of other countries. I have no idea if Trump is serious about taking back the Panama Canal, but even discussions of these natures are really frightening. I don't think anybody knows how far the Trump administration will go with this. It's clear that this is a government that does not think about the medium and long term. It does not think about it has no plan for an international democratic order after the Trump presidency. It's a government that is willing to engage in short-term bullying without thinking about the longer-term costs. And so we don't care too much about our so-called soft power anymore, and we don't care about our longer-term relationships with the region. And that leads to the kind of bullying that we're seeing across the region, including the tariffs against Brazil. Look, everybody in the United States, universities, law firms, businesses, media, institutions across the country are trying to figure out how do you respond to this kind of bullying. And governments across the world, governments in Europe, Canada, Mexico, across Latin America, Asia, are trying to figure out how do you best respond to this kind of bullying. Honestly, if I had the answer, I would have a very well-paid consulting job. My guess is it's going to take some, on both within the United States and globally, it's going to take some kind of collective action, coordination. When this government takes on individual universities, individual media companies, individual politicians, individual firms, individual countries, it's usually able to bully them successfully. I think it's only when, in the United States, universities come together, when the media works together, when law firms work together, and probably when different governments work together, that this kind of bullying can be stopped. I know that's extremely difficult. But to be honest, nobody's figured it out yet.
Silvia, por favor.
Olá, professora. Queria voltar um pouco a essa questão das tendências eleitorais, falando mais especificamente de algumas eleições que vão ocorrer na América Latina nos próximos meses e no próximo ano, né? Nós vamos ter aí, estamos vivendo o processo eleitoral da Bolívia, do Peru, do Chile, da Colômbia, e em todos esses, pelo menos de acordo com as pesquisas mais atuais, a direita parece estar mais à frente que a esquerda. Na Bolívia, se as predições se confirmarem, nós vamos ter uma grande transformação ali com o fim do projeto do MAS. Eu gostaria que o senhor comentasse, se possível, se o senhor crê que está havendo uma nova virada ou guinada à direita dos países da América Latina.
It's a right-wing moment. It is a right-wing moment for a couple of reasons. In part, we're still coming out of a period, an unprecedented period, of left-wing electoral dominance in Latin America. The first part of the 21st century was dominated in Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay, in Chile, by different forms of left and center-left government. And for better or worse, initially there was an economic boom, and so left governments did very well, like here in Brazil. Eventually, there was a very, very difficult second decade of the 21st century in which the commodities boom ended. Crime rose. There were a series of corruption scandals across the region. Then COVID hit. And so by the end of the second decade of the 21st century, voters across Latin America, for good reason, were really unhappy. And the left was the status quo in Brazil. The left was the status quo in Argentina. The left was the status quo in Uruguay. So voters are turning still against that status quo. The left is seen as part of the problem more than part of any solution. Not in every country, but in many countries. The other reason why it's a right-wing moment in Latin America is because of crime and insecurity. Crime and insecurity, if you look at surveys, is either the number one or the number two issue in every country, among voters, in every country in Latin America. Crime is always a right-wing issue. Anytime people are afraid for their security, they turn to the right, not just in Latin America, everywhere in the world. And so the combination of the left being associated with a very difficult last decade and rising very high crime rates and the fact that people are afraid to leave their houses, to walk to work, to take their kids to school, those are things that benefit the right. So yeah, in the last few years we've seen right-wing victories, and I think we're likely to see several more in the years to come.
Luciana, por favor.
Professor, bem-vindo. O senhor mencionou os ataques direcionados do presidente Trump contra organismos de mídia, né, veículos de mídia, escritórios de advocacia, universidades e alguns políticos, né, que são muito os pilares da sociedade civil que sustentam a democracia, o sistema de três poderes, etc. E apesar dessa necessidade de união que o senhor mencionou, a verdade é que muitas dessas instituições fecharam acordos com o governo dentro de possíveis processos, eles cederam. Né? A gente acabou de ver agora a questão da CBS acabando com o programa do Stephen Colbert. A gente teve algo similar com os escritórios de advocacia, com a Universidade de Colômbia. Talvez Harvard, por enquanto, seja o único que insistiu em manter sua posição. Por que outras instituições da sociedade civil, outros atores, não conseguiram assumir essa postura de Harvard e têm cedido às manobras do governo Trump?
This is a great question. I think that most Americans, especially in the elite, in the establishment, whether it's universities, law firms, business, media, politicians, they didn't expect this. We, unlike Brazil, unlike Germany, or South Korea, or Argentina, or Chile, or Spain, we have not experienced authoritarianism. We've never lost democracy before. And very, very few people in the United States, including very educated people in the elite, have any idea how to respond. In fact, most Americans still to this day, despite the fact that I think we've already lost our democracy, most Americans still think it's not possible that the United States could lose its democracy. It's very, very hard for the US elite to come to grips with the fact that this is something unlike anything they've ever seen before. But it is. And so Trump's authoritarianism took the US elite by surprise. It shouldn't have. Some of us had written books saying that we should worry about this, but the US establishment was taken by surprise. They believed when Trump was elected that it would be like the last presidency where, you know, he was kind of crazy, and yeah, it was terrible that he tried to overturn the election, but at the end of the day, America survived. And so they were not expecting these attacks. They were not expecting the systematic weaponization of the state, the fact that Trump would take virtually every agency of the state and use it to systematically punish, attack, bully, co-opt elements of civil society. This was a shock. And for a society that has never experienced authoritarianism, at least not in anybody's lifetime, people literally did not know how to respond. The United States is a very individualistic society. We don't have large interest groups. We don't have a strong union movement. There are not strong associations of businesses and other organizations. So people operate on their own. And so Trump very, very kind of brilliantly went after each individual organization. The administration goes after individuals, and organizations respond as individuals. They have no organization. They have no tradition. They have no practice of coordinating among themselves. And they fall individually. They respond individually, and it is not going well. I mean, one of the reasons why Trump has been so successful, not politically successful, but successful in bullying what should be a very strong, very vibrant civil society, is that each individual agency is negotiating on its own. And until that changes, they're going to continue to steamroll our society.
Itamar, por favor.
Professor, boa noite. Prazer ouvi-lo aqui hoje. Eu gostaria de aproveitar uma parte da sua última resposta para fazer a minha pergunta. Há poucos dias, a ex-vice-presidente Kamala Harris concedeu a sua primeira entrevista ao Stephen Colbert desde a eleição, na qual ela afirmou que ela conseguia antever muito do que Donald Trump tem feito ao longo desses 7 meses de governo. Mas o que ela não conseguia prever, nas palavras da ex-vice-presidente Kamala Harris, é o que ela chamou de capitulação de grande parte da sociedade americana ao que Trump tem feito. Em primeiro lugar, eu gostaria de saber se o senhor concorda com esse diagnóstico da ex-vice-presidente e eu queria também ouvir do senhor qual é o papel do próprio Partido Democrata como a força política de oposição principal ao governo Trump. O senhor enxerga essa capitulação, a vice-presidente Kamala Harris não se refere à capitulação do Partido Democrata, mas o senhor também vê no partido um enfraquecimento como oposição, como a principal força política de oposição ao governo Trump?
Good question. So first of all, I agree with Kamala Harris that virtually everything that Donald Trump is doing are things that he promised to do. He's actually, he didn't keep it as a secret. He said he was going to use the state to investigate his rivals and try to lock up his rivals. He said he was going to go after the media. He said he was going to engage in mass deportations. He said he wanted to use the army to repress protests. None of this was hidden from view. It was promised. What was surprising is how meekly the U.S. civil society responded. We have a very wealthy, muscular civil society. We have hundreds of billionaires. We have literally millions of millionaires. We have almost 2,000 private universities. There's a lot of muscle in our civil society, and yet it has quietly retreated to the sideline. That is the big surprise. It's honestly what all of us in social sciences are trying to understand and to figure out. The Democratic Party's role is important but partial. The Democratic Party suffered a surprising defeat, did not expect to lose the election, and when parties lose elections, they go through a difficult period. It's inevitable, it's normal in a democracy for a party that expected to win, the party of government, loses an election, to go and rethink, to have a bit of a debate, a crisis, and the Democratic Party is having that debate, having that crisis. The problem is this is not a normal time. The Democratic Party is a normal political party, a very sort of moderate, pragmatic, mainstream political party that most of the time behaves in a moderate, pragmatic, mainstream way. But this is not a normal moment. And it's not enough to behave like a normal political party at a time when democracy is being attacked. But it can't speed up the process. It is, it's not, just 9 months after losing a major election, it's just not in a position to have developed a strategy to confront Trump. The other problem is, like civil society, the politicians in the Democratic Party, most of them, especially in the leadership, many of whom are pretty old, they were not trained for this. These guys are mainstream politicians. They know how to win elections. They know how to legislate. They know how to do democratic politics. They don't know how to do authoritarian politics. They don't know how to confront dictatorship. They've never done it before. They were not trained for this. And so I think the Democratic Party's job is to compete in elections and win elections. They will do that in 2026 and 2028, but they're not going to lead the resistance. It's going to require people outside of the Democratic Party, outside of elections. It's going to require civil society pushing back. The Democratic Party eventually will play an important role, but it's not going to be at the head of the movement to resist Trump. It's going to be following. Civil society is going to have to pull the party along.
Okay.
Com isso, então, a gente encerra o nosso primeiro bloco da entrevista com o Steven Levitsky, que vai para um rápido intervalo e o Roda Viva volta em instantes.
Inovação que conecta. Bradesco.
Roda Roda Viva está de volta hoje com o cientista político de Harvard, Steven Levitsky, um dos autores de Como as Democracias Morrem e Como Salvar a Democracia. Professor, nas suas respostas anteriores, o senhor fala de uma certa perplexidade, surpresa do establishment norte-americano com Donald Trump, apesar dele já ter sido presidente, e ter sido presidente que foi, e de ter anunciado na campanha tudo o que faria. No prefácio à edição brasileira do seu mais recente livro, o senhor diz que o Brasil lidou melhor com a questão do ataque à democracia que os próprios Estados Unidos, mostrou ter instituições mais preparadas para isso. No entanto, passados 2 anos, a gente vê crescer um clamor por anistia, por indulto aos que perpetraram as tentativas de golpe, e já parece que não é tão grave. Não foi nada tão grave assim. Talvez tenha sido só um pessoal que estava ali meio sem fazer nada e resolveu quebrar os 3 poderes. A gente tem uma questão de perda de memória política muito rápida. O senhor mesmo falou, Trump conhece pouco a história do pós-guerra, não leu nada. Mas isso é uma realidade também das sociedades, essa perda de memória política muito rápida?
Well, look, I think the parallels between politics in the United States and Brazil over the last nearly decade have been really remarkable. But the fact that the United States is a couple of steps ahead historically gives Brazilians an opportunity to learn. I first came to Brazil in 2018 to try to convince my Brazilian friends not to follow the U.S. path of electing an authoritarian figure as president. Obviously, that didn't go very well. And so both countries elected authoritarian figures as presidents, which is a great risk to democracy. And both of those risks ended up in serious crises, right? Both Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro attempted coups, in a way, presidential coups, modern presidential coups, in which an elected president who loses election tries to overturn the results of that election. In Brazil, it was at least the evidence suggests, an even more seriously orchestrated plot that involved the military, that might have involved assassinations. Trump didn't go that far, but both presidents broke the cardinal rule of democracy. The cardinal rule of democracy is you have to accept defeat in elections. Neither president did. Both of them organized coups. And the question is, how do you respond to that? I think the U.S. institution, we're very proud of our Constitution. It's an old Constitution. We're very proud of our institutional checks. Those institutions failed, one after another after Donald Trump's coup attempt. We have the institution of impeachment and conviction in the Senate, which would have kept Donald Trump from running in 2024, and yet he was not convicted in the Senate. The prosecution of Trump was slow, it was not aggressive, and it was eventually derailed by the Supreme Court, which ruled that presidents have vast immunity for their behavior in office. And so Congress failed to hold Donald Trump accountable. The judiciary failed to hold Donald Trump accountable. The Republican Party, despite the fact that they witnessed his coup attempt, renominated him for president. So the Republican Party, one of the 2 major parties in the United States, failed to hold Donald Trump accountable, and he came back and he did exactly what he said he was going to do, which is kill our democracy. We didn't learn. Our institutions failed miserably. Brazilians could observe that. You had a couple of years to watch, and at least initially, I think the response has been much better. The Brazilian judiciary, for all of its flaws and controversial behavior, stepped up. It did not step to the sideline. It did not retreat in the face of an authoritarian threat. The Brazilian judiciary stepped up and very aggressively prosecuted and looks like probably will convict Jair Bolsonaro. Does that end the threat? Not at all. Does it end polarization? Not at all. I, too, am worried about this movement to sort of downplay the results of what happened in January 2023 and to push for amnesty. That is exactly what happened in the United States. So it's not surprising. I mean, given how successful Trump has been and Trumpism has been, it's not surprising that the Bolsonaro family and their allies are trying to replicate what Trump did. But Brazilians so far seem to know better. And I hope that continues. I think Brazil's democracy is in a much healthier place today than the United States because Brazilian courts have done a much better job of holding Bolsonaro accountable.
Eduardo, acho que sinalizou, depois Robson.
Professor, e aí eu queria fazer o processo contrário. Qual é a lógica dessa Suprema Corte americana de maioria conservadora para ter permitido, inclusive vimos isso durante as eleições no ano passado, um aumento de peso tão grande do Executivo quando as possibilidades de Donald Trump ser esse presidente com aumento de peso do Executivo eram tão claras? Qual é a lógica?
I've been trying to figure out the answer to that question for a long time. You're asking questions that I wish I knew the answer to. I think there are two factors. First of all, it is a right-wing court. This is a very right-wing court. It is not a Trumpist court. It is a right-wing court that believes that the Constitution gives the executive a lot of power. And so the rulings are consistent with a lot of the justices, not all of them, but a majority of justices' view of executive power. But there's another part to the story, which is that they underestimated the threat of Trump. I think they still underestimate the threat of Trump. Like the rest of the U.S. establishment, the justices on the Supreme Court, I think there are 4 of them who can be characterized as right-wing but not Trumpist. They failed to see the threat that Trump posed in the summer of 2024. They, like so many others, thought, Trump will do some crazy things, he'll say some crazy things, but he can't really threaten U.S. democracy. And so they took U.S. democracy for granted. They assumed that the institutions would hold, and so they followed their ideology and ruled in a way that strengthened executive power. I think had they really understood the threat that Trump posed, that they were handing a weapon, a powerful weapon to an authoritarian figure, they might have behaved differently. But it's a combination of it's a right-wing court and it's a court that underestimated the threat that Trump posed.
Robson.
Professor, muito tem se discutido sobre o papel das redes sociais para a disseminação de desinformação e de um apoio fundamental para o crescimento de políticos populistas. Como o senhor vê a questão da regulamentação das redes sociais, a fim de que elas sejam responsabilizadas pela inundação de desinformação que elas ajudam a disseminar?
That's a great question. And I'm not an expert on social media or social media regulation. But it is certainly the case. There is growing evidence, increasing very good evidence that the expansion of social media, access to social media, is one, increasing public discontent towards governments. It's one of the reasons why electorates are so angry at governments, at political elites, why they're voting for the opposition. There is some evidence that access to exposure to social media is benefiting the populist right in many countries. It is helping right-wing politicians. My sense is that this is a dramatically new media technology. All changes in media technology are disruptive, are potentially threatening. We worried a lot about radio when it first emerged. We worried a lot about television when it first emerged. And we are rightly worrying a lot about social media now. Societies are going to have to regulate it. Governments are going to have to regulate social media. They'll respond in different ways. So the United States, my country, is the most libertarian democracy in the world. We tend to resist regulation at the risk of terrible misinformation, et cetera. We are on one side, but it's important to remember, especially these days, the United States is not the only model of democracy in the world. European democracies are much more inclined to regulate social media, to regulate media. There's free speech in Germany, there's free speech in Sweden, in the UK, in France, and Spain. But those democracies are a little bit more balanced in their treatment of free speech versus protection from social harm. So it's very important not to, the United States has an approach to social media which is hyper-libertarian. which is one plausible, one legitimate way of viewing it. We do not like to regulate media, but it's not the only way. And I think eventually it's increasingly clear we're going to have to regulate, not ban, but regulate social media.
Na última vez que nós conversamos, numa entrevista, Javier Milei estava às vésperas de ser eleito como presidente da Argentina. E você me disse que essa era uma decisão arriscada por parte dos eleitores argentinos. Eu gostaria de saber agora, 1 ano e meio depois, se você pode explicar como é possível que Milei ainda tenha uma popularidade alta, mesmo com as fortes políticas de ajuste social, e deve sair ganhador nas eleições legislativas. E como o senhor é um especialista em peronismo, já escreveu sobre o tema, gostaria que o senhor avaliasse a situação do peronismo hoje. Estamos vendo o fim do kirchnerismo, o nascimento de outro peronismo, ou a tendência é que isso acabe?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to point out that Milei is not really popular. Milei has maintained a stable level of popularity that's in the high 40s, 47, 48, 49%. That is sort of similar to Bolsonaro's presidency. This is not Bukele, right? This is not Fujimori, Chavez, Correa, Bukele, which is a really threatening level of public support. It's also not, he's not highly unsuccessful like Alberto Fernandez was with a 20% approval rating. It's a middle level. He's maintained his original support. I think there are two main reasons for that. First of all, he has been fairly successful in stabilizing the economy, and inflation was overwhelmingly the principal concern of Argentine voters when they voted for Milei. And he's done a reasonably good job of bringing inflation down, and he's being rewarded for that. Also, other politicians like AMLO in Mexico, Bukele in El Salvador, have shown that just continuing to attack the old elite in a very aggressive way, punching it in the gut over and over and again, is good politics. It doesn't work forever. Eventually, you need to give people more tangible results. But you can punch the old elite is really unpopular. And if you have some particularly social media talent, you can go on punching them to great effect for a while. So again, Milei is not overwhelmingly popular. He's not even supported by a majority of Argentines. But his performance in bringing inflation down and his continued populism and continuing to bash political parties and a political status quo that most Argentines, especially younger Argentines, are frustrated with, that's been enough to get him through. Peronism is hard to say. I think Peronism is in trouble now because they're attached to a leader who has no future in Cristina Kirchner. She's a very talented politician, but the corruption stuff is real, it's devastating, and a majority of Argentines do not want Cristina Kirchner back. So Peronism's future depends on its ability to get rid of to replace Cristina Kirchner with a new leadership. And party change is hard. It takes years. I mean, it takes sometimes 2, 4, 5 years before a party can renovate. So I don't think Peronism is at the end of the forest yet.
Agora sim, Luciana.
Aqui. Professor, o senhor comentou o ataque às instituições americanas, uma a uma, né, pelo Trump. De forma similar, ele tem praticado isso na política externa dele, econômica e política, com as tarifas, né? Apesar de tudo que representa para o sistema internacional, os riscos à economia americana e de outros países, ele fez isso no momento em que o sistema multilateral está muito fragilizado. Está em baixa, existe esse descontentamento da mesma forma que tem dos eleitorados domésticos com o status quo, existe essa falta de confiança no sistema multilateral. E no curto prazo é possível que a política dele seja bem sucedida, mesmo sendo bullying, sendo chantagem, mas que traga resultados imediatos para os Estados Unidos. O que isso pode significar em termos de política internacional ou mesmo para a política americana e a forma de outros futuros líderes negociarem?
Very, very difficult question. I'm not very well equipped to tell anybody, much less foreign governments, how to deal with my president, because this guy is very difficult to understand. I think you've correctly characterized the Trump administration as pursuing short-term goals at the expense of medium and longer-term goals. This is a guy, Donald Trump, who does not think about the bigger picture. In many cases, he doesn't know or understand the bigger picture, and he doesn't care about the bigger picture. He does not care because he is such a narcissist. He does not care what happens to the United States after he's dead. And unfortunately, unlike his first presidency, when he was surrounded by conservative technocrats and mainstream Republican politicians who were pretty conservative, but who had some experience and did care maybe about what happened in 5 or 10 or 20 years, he was constrained. But this time, he learned his lesson. He didn't want to be constrained, and he surrounded himself by loyalists, by pure loyalists. And so these guys let Donald Trump do whatever he wants. And what he wants is short-term benefits, whatever the longer-term costs. And so in the international system that you mentioned, international trading system, international geopolitical alliances, soft power, the relationships that we have, the really important relationships that we have with countries like Mexico, Canada, Brazil, the EU, those are long-term arrangements. Those are things that you invest in the long run, and that means compromise. It means not taking all the money on the table today so that you maintain a relationship of trust and goodwill in 5 and 10 and 15 years. Not bullying, but you only do those things. You only invest in long-term relationships if you care about long-term relationships. And this guy doesn't care about any of those things, and nobody around him is going to stop him. So what we see, this is not a geopolitical policy towards Brazil. It's not an economic or commercial policy towards Brazil. This is just a whim of Donald Trump, who very much likes to use tariffs because they're a bullying instrument that the executive can use. But it's somebody in the Bolsonaro family convinced Trump that Bolsonaro's case is just like Trump's, that he's suffering a terrible, unfair witch hunt. And this is just a personal whim of Donald Trump's. And unfortunately, the U.S. system, supposedly so good at checking and balancing, has enabled the emergence of a personalistic president who, at least for a while, can behave like a samosa. And we're all, both in the United States and abroad, paying the price for that. So yes, this is a government that has shown itself willing to pursue the short-term benefits of bullying, even if the vast majority of observers, right, center, and left, understand that the medium and longer-term costs are vast.
Sim. Antamar, por favor.
Professor, minha próxima pergunta é justamente sobre o peso da relação pessoal que o presidente Trump teria com o presidente Jair Bolsonaro. Trump já disse, já escreveu que ele se vê pessoalmente ligado ao ex-presidente brasileiro por ter também sofrido o que ele chama de caça às bruxas. Eu queria entender do senhor em que medida este é o fator preponderante nas agressões do presidente Trump ao Brasil, ou se há alguma estratégia por trás dessa decisão, supondo que o presidente Trump seja capaz de conceber uma estratégia mais abrangente para a região, para a América Latina, de tentar influenciar o resultado das eleições no Brasil no ano que vem e, de certa medida, ter o país como principal força política e econômica da região na esfera de influência dos Estados Unidos novamente, tendo possivelmente um presidente aliado. Em que medida a relação pessoal de Trump com Bolsonaro conta, ou se Trump tem uma visão mais estratégica, pensando um pouco mais adiante?
I could be wrong. but it's very difficult for me to discern a broader or long-term strategy here. There's no question that the Trump administration would prefer to have either Bolsonaro or Bolsonarista government in place in Brazil. And because Brazil is so important geopolitically, that's clearly on the government's mind. I'll get back to that in a second. But I think what is predominating is simply Trump's personal whim. And again, somebody entered his inner circle and convinced him that there was a great injustice going on in Brazil that was so similar to the great injustice that he thinks he felt, that I think this is primarily a personal whim. If the United States is able to influence the election in 2026, that's all the better. But I don't think there's a long-term strategy for Latin America here. I could be wrong. But it's important to say, it's really hard to influence elections in other countries. Putin often fails, it's a very, very powerful government, has tried and failed repeatedly to influence democratic elections in other countries. One of the reasons for the war in Ukraine is that Putin kept losing elections in Ukraine that he tried to influence. The United States tried to prevent Allende from getting elected. Going back further, it tried to prevent Perón from getting elected. It tried to prevent Evo Morales from getting elected. It tried to prevent Chavez in Korea from getting elected. It's really hard, even for big powers like the United States, to influence democratic elections. So if the United States has an illusion, if the Trump administration thinks that its maneuvers, that its bullying is going to shape the election in Brazil, I think it's an illusion.
Agora, e questões econômicas? Porque tem uma questão toda do Brasil ser muito rico em terras raras, em minérios críticos e estratégicos, e também tem a questão das Big Techs, que ganharam uma grande importância e um grande acesso no governo Trump e estão em rota de colisão com a justiça brasileira. Esses interesses das Big Techs e dos Estados Unidos em minérios do Brasil podem ter ajudado a tornar o Brasil alvo preferencial?
Maybe. Again, I have not seen much evidence that this administration has a long-term strategic plan. And if the interest is in access to certain minerals, it's a similar situation to Greenland. We are talking about militarily occupying Greenland or somehow bullying Denmark into taking Greenland because we want. But there are other more peaceful ways through trade to gain access to precious minerals. So, yes, Brazil, there's a lot in Brazil, both economically and politically, geopolitically, but I have not seen much evidence that the United States has a systematic plan for Brazil. I think this government would like to have friends in power in Brazil, believes probably correctly that it will that it would be geopolitically and economically beneficial. But even if Bolsonaro or Bolsonaro's wife were president of Brazil, Brazil's a big country. They're not going to hand over. Nobody in Brazil is going to hand over precious minerals to the Trump administration. So again, I think that if the Trump administration believes that things will be dramatically different, that the United States will get great benefits from a Bolsonaro government, I think it's exaggerating.
Certo. Com isso, então, a gente fecha o segundo bloco, vai para mais um rápido intervalo e volta já já com mais Steven Levitsky. Não sai daí.
Inovação que conecta. Bradesco.
Roda Viva está de volta, hoje recebendo o cientista político Steven Levitsky, autor de best-sellers na área da democracia. Quem pergunta agora para ele é a Luciana Coelho.
Professor, aqui. A Vera mencionou as Big Techs, né, as empresas de tecnologia. Existe uma aliança cada vez mais forte e maior entre essas empresas e o governo Trump, que não existia no primeiro mandato, ou existia de forma pontual. Como o senhor enxerga a relevância dessa aliança e que riscos que ela acarreta?
It's a very fragile alliance. Big tech was the golden boy in the United States for a generation, going back certainly the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Both parties, but especially the Democrats, were very, very kind to big tech. Big tech was treated as a national hero. It was not regulated. It was not seriously taxed. And big tech leaders were held up as heroes. The United States has become much, much more unequal, and some of the negative consequences of big tech and social media have emerged. So naturally, as occurs in a democracy, there's a movement to begin to regulate big tech. And big tech reacted as business very often does, which is it moved to the right. They had what could only be described as an hysterical reaction to the very moderate centrist regulatory policies of the Biden administration. So we went from not complete, but largely a deregulated environment in which big tech could do what it wants and was a hero, to a point where elements of the Democratic Party were beginning to push for greater regulation and for greater redistribution, because we have the highest levels of inequality in the United States since before the Great Depression. The Biden administration moves a little bit to the left on this stuff, and big tech freaks out and runs into the arms of Trump. But I'm not sure the alliance is going to last. It's very, very fragile. Big tech is very cosmopolitan. Big tech needs immigrants. And so a backward-looking policy of cutting the United States off from the world, of cutting the United States off from trade, cutting the United States off from talent from all over the world, destroying research, destroying universities, none of that is useful to big tech. And so we are already seeing a splitting. There are some very, very high-profile tech billionaires who continue to support Trump, who are very, very ideologically right-wing, but many others are beginning already to reconsider their support for Trump. So I think this alliance is not going to be very durable.
Tamar.
Professor, agora eu vou explorar os seus talentos premonitórios tão bem-sucedidos no campo do futebol. E eu gostaria de saber o que o senhor acha que acontecerá nas eleições de meio de mandato nos Estados Unidos, se o governo Trump continuará tendo maioria em ambas as casas, ou se os democratas têm alguma chance de obter maioria ou na Câmara dos Representantes ou no Senado.
Again, a soccer prediction would be much, much more reliable than any political predictions that I make. I think there is a very, very good chance that the Democrats will win more votes in the 2026 elections, probably many more votes. There are lots of reasons for that, but in the midterm elections, the opposition party almost always wins and does better. There are good reasons for that. I won't get into great detail, but it is very likely that we see an electoral shift towards the Democrats, because that is what always happens. There's a bit of an opposition vote. Now, whether the Democrats will win more seats depends, because the Trump administration is preparing to cheat in this election. Now, cheating may take multiple forms, but the one that is almost certain to happen is what we call gerrymandering, changing around the districts in different states, particularly Texas, but there may be other states as well, to ensure that even if the Republican Party wins fewer votes in 2026, that it doesn't win fewer seats, that it may win even more seats with fewer votes. This is an authoritarian tactic that was done very effectively by Viktor Orban. Gerrymandering has a long history in the United States, but this is a new level of explicitly authoritarian gerrymandering, an attempt to win the election despite losing more votes. That's very likely to happen. A war is about to break out in the United States, state by state, in sort of competing gerrymandering, but it looks like the Republicans could benefit from that, and so you may see the Democrats win more votes, but not win control of the Congress for that reason. There's also less certain, but some discussion of efforts to make it more difficult for people to register, for people to vote. I think there may be efforts to intimidate voters. One of the great signals of the pardon of the January 6th insurrectionists, and here is an important lesson for Brazilians, is what Trump basically signaled to violent supporters was, if you engage in violence on behalf of me, on behalf of Trump, you will be protected. You will be pardoned. And so I think that will encourage aggressive, potentially threatening behavior towards voters on election day. So there are multiple ways in which the Republicans could win the 2026 election, even if they lose support.
Silvia.
Professor, queria fazer uma pergunta sobre a Venezuela. A gente acaba de atravessar o primeiro aniversário da fraude eleitoral, da mais nova, mais recente fraude eleitoral do chavismo na Venezuela. E a situação em todos os campos, como se não pudesse estar pior, está pior. A economia vem atravessando uma séria crise, jornalistas e políticos opositores ou estão presos ou exilados. Eu queria consultá-lo sobre o que o senhor acha que vai acontecer na Venezuela nos próximos anos.
Oh, these are tough predictions to make. Last year's election was very disappointing. This was, first of all, the most egregious electoral fraud in all of Latin America in a century. I cannot think of as egregious a fraud, maybe Mexico in the 1920s, but there is no election fraud as egregious as this in anybody's lifetime, anywhere in Latin America. The opposition did an extraordinary job of mathematically demonstrating the fraud. This is, I think, the first time in the history of the world in which an election fraud has been mathematically proven. And to me, it was devastating to see how little the world reacted. There was some reaction. I really would have liked to see the Brazilian government take a much more aggressive stand in defense of democracy, in opposition to as overt an authoritarian regime as we've seen on this continent in any of our lifetimes, or no, in decades, in half a century. And it didn't do it. Colombia could have done more, Brazil could have done more. To me, there was no guarantee that pressure would have worked, but Democrats throughout the world must fight authoritarianism. They must fight authoritarianism on the left, they must fight authoritarianism on the right. And the unwillingness to do it was painful to see. Impossible to predict what will happen. Maduro could fall tomorrow and everybody will understand it because the economy is terrible, people are miserable, the repression is horrible, the government is not popular, the government has support of 20-something support of Venezuelans. But as long as they're able to control the military, largely through fear and through bribery, they can hang on. The sad truth is that dictators sometimes are able to hang on for years and even decades, even if they're internationally isolated, even if they are unpopular. But this is a weak government. This is a vulnerable government. Iran is in trouble. Russia is preoccupied elsewhere. China doesn't really care very much about the Venezuelan government. This government is on its own. It's unpopular, and it doesn't really have a path out. So it's going to continue to be unpopular.
Sad.
And one other thing about Venezuela that's worth keeping in mind is that the fraud was so outrageous and so naked that every Venezuelan knows, every single Venezuelan citizen knows that election was stolen, which means that every representative of the state, every police officer, every bureaucrat, every time they walk out in the streets and they look a citizen in the eye, they know that those citizens know that they stole the election. This is a regime without legitimacy. And so I cannot predict it will fall, but it's vulnerable.
Robson.
Professor, o presidente Donald Trump, ele considera o BRICS, o bloco econômico, como um bloco anti-americano dominado sobre a China, pela China, desculpe. Eu queria ouvir a opinião do senhor sobre qual o impacto, o peso político de fazer parte do BRICS e, em última instância, qual é a relevância do BRICS hoje no contexto geopolítico atual.
Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that Donald Trump considers even its allies, the European Union, to also be anti-American. Sometimes he considers Canada and Mexico to be anti-American. So basically, any organization internationally that does not roll over to the United States is considered un-American. That's not good foreign policy from the United States standpoint, but that's the way that Trump views the world. This is a very uncertain moment in terms of geopolitics. We thought we knew the direction of things in the last 25 years. The world was becoming more multipolar. China and the United States were two rival blocs. Russia was a third, and that would give emerging at large countries like Brazil and India a certain amount of room to maneuver in this more multipolar world. Now a lot of things are uncertain. The United States is wavering between remaining the leader of the liberal West, which everybody expected it would be, and maybe jumping over to the other side. This government, there are days in which the United States positions itself as more aligned with Russia or more sympathetic to Russia than to Europe or to Canada or to Latin America, and which is, in my view, insane. And from the standpoint of the liberal West, to see the leader, the political, economic, and military leader of the liberal West threatening to defect to the illiberal side is terrifying. But we don't know. The policy changes from day to day. So in this context, it's a very uncertain moment for countries like Brazil. But it does seem more important than ever to balance against the United States government. Brazil is going to need allies if it's going to maintain independence from the United States. Now, I'm not a big fan of Brazil's relationship with Russia or China, but I can understand the move geopolitically. Brazil is going to need allies, and it's not going to get, at least for the next 3.5 years, it's not going to get a partnership with the United States.
Certo. Com isso, então, a gente fecha mais um bloco, vai para outro intervalo bem rápido e volta já já com a entrevista de Steven Levitsky aqui no Roda Viva.
Inovação que conecta. Bradesco.
Roda Viva de volta, hoje recebendo um convidado internacional, o cientista político Steven Levitsky. Professor, nós vimos agora o uso da lei Magnitsky, criada originalmente para punir terroristas, criminosos e, enfim, pessoas que atentam contra os direitos humanos, usada contra um magistrado brasileiro. Existe a ameaça de que esse instrumento volte a ser usado contra outros integrantes da nossa Corte Suprema, o Supremo Tribunal Federal. Existe uma possibilidade da Suprema Corte norte-americana intervir nisso e entender que existe um instrumento legal sendo usado de forma deturpada?
Yeah, you're right that the legal instrument is being used in the wrong way. This is a law or a mechanism that is designed for terrorists. And Alexandre de Moraes is many things. He is not a terrorist, and he is not a threat to the national security of the United States. So clearly, unambiguously, this law is being misapplied. That's very typical of the Trump administration. The Trump administration is abusing laws across the country, domestically and internationally. In immigration law, it is declaring national emergencies where there are no emergencies. It is beginning or threatening to deploy Army troops to put down protest, declaring emergencies where there are no emergencies. So the abuse of the law under basically false pretexts is very common in this administration, is very likely to continue, and it's unfortunate that the Brazilian Supreme Court was a victim of that. Harvard is also a victim of that.
Sí.
I doubt that the Supreme Court will intervene on this. The reason is that the Supreme Court, especially this conservative majority, it's very, very different. It's much more cautious than the Brazilian Supreme Court. To strike down the Trump administration's use of this law, it would have to declare that the administration is lying about the problem or that it is misdiagnosing the problem. It's declaring an emergency or declaring a threat where a threat does not exist. This Supreme Court will never set the precedent of allowing the Supreme Court to say to the executive branch that it is misdiagnosing a problem. That, I think this Supreme Court views that as overstepping its bounds. So I'd be very, very surprised.
Uau. Edu.
Professor, o senhor mencionou agora na resposta para Vera o envio de tropas que o governo Trump fez há poucos meses atrás da Guarda Nacional para Los Angeles para enfrentar manifestantes que protestavam contra a política de imigração e a violência dessa política de imigração contra imigrantes não documentados e documentados também. Para muitos angelenos, o que aconteceu em Los Angeles é que a cidade estava sob ocupação militar. O senhor corrija-me se eu estiver errado ou se eu estiver sendo simplista, mas uma das suas definições de autoritarismo competitivo é aquele regime que não utiliza as Forças Armadas, não utiliza tanques contra a sua própria população. O governo Trump, nesse sentido, cruzou uma linha vermelha?
That's a good question. So competitive authoritarianism is a type of authoritarianism that has the outward features of democracy. You have a civilian elected president, a civilian government, not a military government, but the government abuses power, weaponizes the state in ways that tilt the playing field against the opposition. And that's what we're seeing day after day after day in the United States. The militarization issue, I mean, the distinction about competitive authoritarianism is you don't have the military in power. The military is subordinate to the civilian government. That is what makes competitive authoritarianism different from the kind of authoritarianism we saw in South America in the 1970s. The civilians are in charge. Trump is in charge. So the fact that he's deploying the military in Los Angeles doesn't necessarily depart from the definition of competitive authoritarianism. But I think it's important to say that there are signs that this government is willing to contemplate abandoning the rule of law entirely, that it is beginning, in some cases, to openly violate the law, knowingly violate the law, and defy the courts. And if it does that systematically, if the courts say, no, you can't send troops in to repress protests, and they do it anyway. Or if they build, as they seem to intend to do, a kind of paramilitary force in ICE, turning the immigration police into a kind of a secret police with masked agents and coming out of unmarked cars, abducting people in the streets in violation of due process, sending them to concentration camps, which this sounds exaggerated. They're being built. If that proceeds, and it may not, but if it does, we may be spiraling into something that is worse than competitive authoritarianism.
Luciana.
Professor, o senhor mencionou o uso do gerrymandering, do redesenho de distritos, sobretudo pelo Partido Republicano. E o senhor, nos dois livros, principalmente no segundo, faz várias recomendações de mudanças no sistema eleitoral americano. O senhor enxerga, num pós-Trump, um apetite para implementar essas mudanças? Talvez o sistema americano pode, finalmente, depois de 200 anos, estar mais aberto a isso depois de Donald Trump?
It's hard to say. We wrote our most recent book in Brazil. It's How to Save Democracy, with an eye towards reforms to making our democracy more democratic. We wrote it before Donald Trump was reelected in the hope that at some point soon there might be a consensus, a political consensus in the United States for reform, because the United States has, as you mentioned, many of our political rules, many of our institutions are more than 200 years old. Some of them work well, some of them work very badly. The Electoral College is a disaster. We're the only presidential democracy in the world where the loser of the popular vote can win the presidency. And we have a situation with our electoral system, as we mentioned earlier, where a party can win fewer votes, but more seats. So our hope was that we would contribute to a consensus of a need for reform. But in the short term, I see no possibility of reform, because the level of polarization between the two parties is such that they can't even agree on a budget. They can't agree on anything. So the likelihood that the two parties would reach a consensus on a change in the rules of the game right now is zero. It's only in a post-Trump world where an important faction of the Republican Party decides that we need to find a new way of doing politics. It's only then that we have a possibility of reform.
Itamar.
Professor, eu não quero entrar aqui em detalhes sobre os impactos econômicos da guerra tarifária deflagrada pelo presidente Trump, mas há economistas no mundo inteiro analisando que, em boa medida, essas tarifas impostas por Donald Trump irão se reverter em malefícios para a economia dos Estados Unidos. Em que medida, do ponto de vista político, o senhor enxerga espaço para uma mobilização da opinião pública americana diante desses eventos econômicos adversos que certamente virão dessa guerra tarifária, de modo a aumentar, a partir da opinião pública, que, como o senhor bem disse, é uma opinião pública muito viva, muito forte, muito rica nos Estados Unidos, bastante influente, e isso servir como uma espécie de contenção para essa postura hostil, por vezes muito agressiva, do governo americano em relação a outros países?
It might, but I think only moderately so. The one thing that hurts Trump in public opinion, and the less popular Trump is, the less damage I think he can do. So the way to constrain Trump is for his popularity to fall. If the economy underperforms, as it is beginning to underperform, that will hurt Trump, but not a lot, only a little. U.S. political identities today are very entrenched. They're much more about identities, who you identify with, how you envision the country, how you envision the society you live in, not you wake up one day and if the government is performing economically well, you vote for it. If it's performing poorly, you vote against it. No, people join teams and they are attached to those teams, and they so hate the other party that a lot of terrible things can happen before they're willing to defect. So there is 30, maybe 35% of the U.S. electorate that is going to stick to Trump probably no matter what. Unless there is a massive depression. And so Trump's never going to fall to levels of public disapproval that we see with really unpopular presidents like Dilma or Temer. That's just never going to happen. What will happen is he's already fallen from about 50% when he took office to about 43, 42% today. And that could continue to fall, but it won't fall to 10. It'll fall to 35, 36, 37.
Silvia.
Professor, você mencionou o presidente de El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, na resposta anterior, e eu gostaria de saber se o senhor já considera que pode-se rotulá-lo como um ditador depois dessa última decisão do governo salvadorenho de deixar que haja reeleição indefinida do líder do país.
Yes, I think it's safe to say that, unfortunately, Latin America has witnessed its fourth dictatorship with Bukele. You had Cuba, you had Venezuela, you had Nicaragua, and now, sadly, El Salvador. Anybody who is an opponent of the Salvadoran government now, including all of the independent media, they're not living in El Salvador. You cannot actively, publicly oppose the Bukele government and live within the territory of El Salvador anymore. And that suggests to me this is not a competitive authoritarian regime. This is an outright dictatorship.
Robson.
Professor, considerando os regimes que são antidemocráticos de esquerda e de direita, o que o senhor acha que tem em comum e as diferenças desses regimes para tentar minar as instituições democráticas?
I think the most important point here is that authoritarianism doesn't have a political party. It doesn't have an ideological flavor. There are authoritarian governments of the left and the right, and they can be very similar. They can be surprisingly similar. Trump is behaving and talking in ways that evoke Hugo Chavez to me. That sound a lot like Hugo Chavez. So for the most part, there's not a certain left-wing variant of authoritarianism or a right-wing variant of authoritarianism. It certainly is not true, as some people on the left and right say, that only the left is authoritarian or only the right is authoritarian. We have lots of good examples of authoritarians on both sides. I think there's an interesting change in recent years, though. For most of the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, left-wing authoritarianism was much more ideological. And it involved much greater efforts to really transform the state and really transform society. Leftist authoritarians were convinced that capitalism had sort of distorted the state and society, and you really needed to use authoritarian force to purge the state, purge civil society, and transform it. That was what underlied the Castro government. You saw a weaker effort of that in Nicaragua. You saw it with Chavismo. And what's interesting now is you're starting to see that in right-wing authoritarianism. The right is much more ideological, the far right, the extremist right, is much more ideological today than the left. Mm-hmm. The left, and we could talk about this more, I think has lost its program, has lost its ideology, for better or worse. The only folks with a really coherent ideological project is the radical right. These guys think, crazily in my view, that the state and society, universities, social institutions have been captured by the Marxist left, or the woke left, as we say in the United States, and need to be purged through active, aggressive state intervention. And that's what the Trump administration is trying to do. Mm-hmm. That's why it's pummeling universities in the United States. That's why it's purging and weaponizing the state, because they really believe that they are purging the country of this sort of woke Marxist influence and bringing us back to some better day. So you're seeing right-wing authoritarians in the United States behaving like left-wing authoritarians used to several decades ago.
Certo. Com isso, então, a gente vai para o nosso último intervalo. Voltamos já já com o encerramento desse Roda Viva tão importante com o Steven Levitsky.
Inovação que conecta. Bradesco.
O seu filme.
Nós estamos de volta e a entrevista hoje é com o cientista político Steven Levitsky. No último bloco, o senhor respondeu ao Robinson sobre como a esquerda é vista hoje em dia como representante do que se chama de cultura woke nos Estados Unidos, aqui no Brasil, identitarismo. De que maneira essas conquistas com políticas afirmativas, com uma democracia mais inclusiva do ponto de vista racial e de minorias, que foi uma conquista dos Estados Unidos nesse início do século XXI, contribuiu para essa virada do que o senhor chama de tirania das minorias, e como que a esquerda pode sair dessa armadilha e voltar a falar com um espectro mais amplo da sociedade?
This is one of the great challenges of our time. And this is true in Brazil and it's true in the United States, which is learning to live in a multiracial society and learning how to build a functioning multiracial democracy. There's no other way. There's no other way to be a democracy in Brazil or the United States today without being a truly multiracial democracy. And in my view, at the core, at the heart of the reaction, the authoritarian reaction, both in the United States and Brazil, at the heart of that, it's not Marxism, it's not wokeism, it's a reaction to the movements that democracy has brought towards greater inclusion and greater equality. Not socialist equality, but the United States in 2016 was a much, much more inclusive society than it was 50 years before. And Brazil in 2016 was a much more inclusive society than it was before the transition in the 1980s. And ultimately, that's what this is a reaction against. Movements toward greater inclusion, movements towards greater social equality always inevitably trigger a reaction. The question is how big the reaction is and how it can be contained. And frankly, it's been a much more fierce reaction, at least in the United States, than I anticipated.
Sim. Luciana.
Professor, o senhor mencionou as similaridades entre autoritários de esquerda e de direita, esse blur que tem, de certa forma, nas agendas, falou da falta de agenda da esquerda nesse momento, e eu mesma me pergunto onde está a direita liberal moderada, sobretudo nos Estados Unidos. O senhor acha que o conceito de direita e esquerda, como a gente estudou, como a gente aplica hoje, ele ainda faz sentido ou a gente precisa repensar a forma como a gente categoriza as forças políticas?
I think left and right, as we may have learned them in the 20th century, which is basically Marxism, socialism versus capitalism, that probably is not the way that left and right shakes out anymore. But never, ever, ever believe someone who tells you that left and right doesn't exist anymore. Left and right will always exist. There will always be a conflict between those who seek greater equality, and the terms of that equality might be economic, it might be race, it might be gender, it may be something I can't think of now that comes in the future. But there will always be those who seek greater equality, and there will always be those who want to maintain hierarchies and existing inequalities. And that is the foundation of left and right. So Cold War socialism may end, and the debate between Milton Friedman and Fidel Castro may be irrelevant, but there will always be some form of conflict between left and right, and it's evolved a lot. Right now in the West, the conflict is a little more complicated because it really isn't left and right. In the United States and in much of Europe, it's much more of a sort of urban liberal cosmopolitanism, which includes the sort of liberal center right, but also the left, and an ethno-nationalist, religious, mostly rural-based force. And that is very different. I'm not sure that's forever, but the conflict in Western Europe and the United States now is really between cosmopolitanism, liberal cosmopolitanism, and illiberal ethno-nationalism.
Interessante esse conceito. Edu.
Professor, aqui, Dado o tamanho desse desafio que o senhor acabou de mostrar para a gente, parece muito pouco para o Partido Democrata vencer as eleições de meio de mandato no ano que vem sem ter um projeto de país claro que se contraponha ao trumpismo e meio que empurrar com a barriga um problema tão sério para 2028. O senhor consegue enxergar hoje alguém no Partido Democrata que possa ser essa liderança, um partido que parece acéfalo, ou possibilidades de caminhos para esse partido, não só para 2026, mas para 2028?
O governador da Califórnia, talvez,
Gavin Newsom.
Let me first answer this in more general terms, and then I'll get to candidates. The center-left in the entire democratic world really has no program. It has become basically a defender of a status quo that is more inclusive than 30 or 40 years ago, but that doesn't really have a forward vision. So whether it is Canada or Great Britain or Germany or France or the United States or Brazil, frankly, the center-left doesn't really have a project. It can win elections because, as we said earlier, voters are very unhappy with the status quo, and if the right is in power and the right doesn't govern well, the left can win. It won a few years ago in Germany. It won last year in the UK. Joe Biden won. But it loses popularity very quickly, and then it loses again. So it's possible for the Democratic Party, which is suffering the same problems as the center-left in Germany and Britain and elsewhere, it's possible to win because Trump probably isn't going to be very popular for some of the reasons we talked about. The economy is not going well. Many of the things that Trump is doing is not popular. His approval rating is declining slowly, but it's declining. So the Democrats, just by being opposition, could win. But it's not a long-term solution. The center-left has a lot of thinking to do all over the world. A lot of innovation has to happen if the center-left is going to become a force going forward. It's really hard to determine who will be the most successful candidate. Again, I think as long as the country does not tilt too far into authoritarianism, the Democrats will have a very good chance to win just, again, by being opposition. They're probably going to need a candidate because the biggest change, I think, in the United States, not really a shift to the right so much as a shift towards more informal politics, towards more authentic politics. Traditional politicians, and it's the same here in Brazil, have a harder and harder time winning. Voters don't like traditional politicians. They don't like politicians who speak like politicians. They like people who are more authentic. In the United States, the key issue now is you have to be able to get on a podcast with anybody and talk about anything. Democrats are not trained to do that. They have lots of consultants. They're very traditional, tie and jacket politicians, and they have carefully prepared answers, and they seem too political, too traditional. And one problem with Gavin Newsom is I think he comes off as, although he's trying to become a 21st century politician, he comes off as a typical politician, insufficiently authentic. So my guess is the more successful Democratic candidate will be somebody probably younger and probably seen as a little bit more of an outsider and less of an established politician.
Silvia.
Professor, eu gostaria de saber, já que a gente já está caminhando para a parte final do programa, como é que o senhor fez essa previsão de que a Argentina ia ganhar a última Copa do Mundo e se o senhor acha que a seleção brasileira está vivendo um certo ocaso, o fim de uma mística, já que o time não ganha uma Copa do Mundo há mais de 20 anos?
I think it's Brazil's time. It doesn't seem like it.
Is Brazil's time
Doesn't
to win
seem
again?
like it, but I think we're getting close to a Brazilian moment.
Wow.
This world cannot go 30 years without a Brazilian victory in the World Cup. So I spent many years predicting an Argentine victory in the World Cup, and like a clock that has stopped, eventually I was right. But now I think it's Brazil's time.
E nos Estados Unidos, hein? Ganharmos em solo americano, em solo de Donald Trump. Robson, por favor.
Professor, eu queria continuar com esse chapéu premonitório. Olhando nas próximas décadas, que a democracia global tem uma série de desafios. A gente pode pensar na questão, o impacto da emergência climática, o avanço altamente disruptivo da tecnologia e até, eventualmente, eu acho que a ascensão de uma autocracia como a China como modelo alternativo de poder. Que impacto que o senhor acha que essas questões ou outras grandes questões globais podem ter para a manutenção ou a preservação da democracia global?
As you can see, I've got no hat, and the only thing I can predict is World Cups. You point to some very, very serious challenges, very real challenges, and I think two of the most important ones. I think climate change, it's very hard to anticipate how democracies will respond and whether democracies will be able to respond. There is a terrible cycle emerging in which climate change is forcing people in parts of Africa and elsewhere, Central America as well, to migrate. It's making parts of the world unlivable. It's forcing migration and into wealthier countries, and that migration is leading to right-wing reactions that are making democratic governments more authoritarian. That's a cycle that keeps me awake at night. The changes in tech and technology and in artificial intelligence, particularly unregulated artificial intelligence, as we're seeing in the United States, also creates several nightmare scenarios. I'm a little less worried about China. There have been, ever since the Bolshevik Revolution, and really almost every decade, there's always been a country that commentators have said, oh, that country's doing better than the democracies. We should be like the Soviet Union, or we should be like the fascists, or we should be like Cuba, or we should be like China. And in the long run, first of all, in the long run, the economic performance of authoritarian regimes is not superior to democracy. So there are always moments where Bukele looks like he's got the solution, or Fujimori looked like he had the solution, or even Hugo Chavez looked like he had the solution. Eventually, that does not bear out. Secondly, Latin Americans, voters in democracies all over the world are very, very discontented with democracies, with their governments. But the one thing that they like, that they want, and I think they insist upon, is the right to vote out governments they don't like. There's nobody in Latin America, nobody, clamoring for a China model. Nobody wants to get rid of elections. They want to get rid of their parties, they want to get rid of their politicians, they don't like the status quo, but Latin Americans and citizens throughout the world continue to value the right to vote out governments they don't like. And that's what gives me hope that there will continue to be a pushback for democracy.
Certo. Nós temos mais 1 minuto e meio, Itamar, para uma pergunta e uma resposta bem rápidas.
Professor, acho que podemos afirmar que hoje Brasil e Estados Unidos vivem um dos momentos mais dramáticos, mais tensos das suas relações em mais de 200 anos. O que o senhor acha que precisa acontecer para que ambos os países, as duas maiores democracias das Américas, voltem a ter uma relação minimamente pragmática e civilizada?
I think it may take getting burned. I think Americans, for example, may have to face a situation in which the Trump administration plunges us into either an unpopular war or a devastating economic crisis before we learn that, okay, it's stupid to elect a reality TV show guy as a president. I think we need to touch the stove and get burned before we restore ourselves to a more pragmatic set of governments. Brazilians, talking to Brazilians, I think have not strayed as far from the search for some reasonable consensus as the United States. I think Brazilian politics is very polarized. It's very messy, but the status quo is not quite as unsustainable here as in the United States. So I think the United States is going through a very, very difficult journey in which I'm now convinced that we're going to have to fall before we learn.
Professor, muito obrigada pela entrevista. Foi um prazer recebê-lo aqui no nosso estúdio. Volte sempre, espero para falar de dias melhores.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. É isso, nosso tempo, infelizmente, chegou ao fim. Eu agradeço também a essa equipe maravilhosa que conduziu a entrevista: Eduardo Graça, Luciana Coelho, Itamar Montalvão, Robinson Borges, Silvia Colombo, Áurea Dalbó, que traduziu a entrevista, e Luciano Veronese. Obrigada a você pela sua audiência atenta. No livro Como Salvar a Democracia, Steven Levitsky e Daniel Ziblatt propõem uma série de reformas que poderiam ser adotadas por países que enfrentam uma polarização política extremada, a erosão institucional e a ascensão de populistas autoritários, seja de extrema-direita ou de extrema-esquerda. Elas incluem, muitas vezes, a revisão de leis que foram pensadas para outros tempos e hoje não impedem que as democracias sejam dilapidadas a partir de dentro. E incluem o que os autores chamam de educação cívica, algo cada vez mais complexo em tempos em que a mídia e espaços como as universidades também estão sob permanente ataque. Roda Viva volta na próxima segunda-feira com mais um programa para fazer pensar. Como sempre, às 10 da noite, e eu espero você. Até lá!
Inovação que conecta. Bradesco.